Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I'm very excited to be talking about something I've been looking at and studying and been very passionate about, which is stakeholder capitalism. And as we get started into this, I would welcome you to say, first of all, welcome and where you're coming from, and also just how would you define stakeholder capitalism? Because that's what I'm going to be doing today. Would love to hear your take on it. And this is something you should know over the next 4 weeks. I'm going to be talking about this topic, about what the reality is, what does it look like today, how do we actually measure it, a big question and issue, and then also just how do you start actually practicing this and how to avoid some of the pitfalls around stakeholder capitalism. It is a big, woolly topic, so I wanted to spend the whole month talking about this and beginning today with what is it? Why is it important right now? Why does it matter? And why should we be spending any time and effort thinking about this? Well, let me talk to you about my journey with this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. And I remember distinctly sitting at my kitchen table in August of 2019. And back then, I actually still subscribed to print newspapers and was leafing through the Wall Street Journal. And I came across this full page ad, and this is what it looked like. Let me just put it up here. It said, let's get to work. And in greater detail went on. It was a statement from the Business Roundtable. And this is what it actually said. It said that it had a statement about the purpose of a corporation. And you have to understand, up to this point, everything when it came to the purpose of a corporation was to maximize shareholder value. And here was a statement from the preeminent business association for the largest businesses in the US saying, oh, no, it's not about maximizing shareholder value. It's about maximizing stakeholder value. And my jaw just dropped. I looked at this in amazement. And I'm going, this is a watershed moment, because now here are 181 CEOs of leading companies in the US who all signed this statement saying, yeah, we agree with this. We're no longer here just to maximize shareholder value measured in stock price. We really want to maximize value for everybody in our ecosystems. And they include customers, employees, suppliers and partners, community and planet, as well as shareholders. And just to give you an idea of how much of a breakthrough this was, first of all, this was met by a lot of skepticism. People say, yeah, this is great, but you CEOs, are you really serious about this? What are you doing? How are you demonstrating this? And then in very quick order, the pandemic hit. And a lot of people were like, oh, do you really care about your employees? You're just laying them off. Are you taking care of them? And it really put a big, huge spotlight on this question of, if we want to be truly living up to these ideas of stakeholder capitalism, that we're using the engine of capitalism to actually support the betterment and the rising up of everybody, not just shareholders, then what do we have to do fundamentally differently as leaders of corporations to make this actually happen? And so this began a whole series of work around this, and I'll go into a little bit detail more. But I want to just talk and share a little bit about what actually has been the problem with shareholder capitalism. And I mean, why do we even have to worry about this? Because in many ways, capitalism has worked extremely well for over 100 years, 200 years. And if you think about it, capitalism was the source of so much development, and in particular, the rising up of the middle class, the living conditions in capitalist societies just increased tremendously. But it also came with some downsides, especially as Karl Marx wrote about it, when people were being exploited for the works of the works of their hands, and workers were just being exploited. So thus began the rise of unions, communism, so many other things to counter the bad parts of capitalism. But in many ways, it has worked really well, these free markets and the idea that you could put capital to work and it could be owned by many different people. So the problem is that in 1970s, so through the first part of capitalism, much of it worked pretty well, because by nature, by humanistic urges, by philanthropy means, many companies were practicing some form of stakeholder capitalism. They were checking their ambitions of how much they were exploiting people. They were being checked by unions. They were trying to do the right thing by giving people fair living wages. And so there's lots of examples of capitalism trying to do the right thing. And then in 1970s, a Nobel Prize winning economist, Milton Friedman, came out with a statement. And he said, the purpose of a corporation is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's a key thing there, which is to say engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. And again, the whole idea is to increase its profits, to return it back to the shareholders. So he really put increasing shareholder value in the form of profits as a primary purpose of a corporation. Now, companies read this, and in particular, one CEO read this, Jack Welch, and said, well, this is great. I can define my success as a CEO through the increasing price of my shares every quarter. And that's how I can demonstrate that I'm a great CEO. And so this became the primacy of shareholder value expressed in the form of quarterly profits and especially increasing share prices. Now, looking back, we can now lift up the covers to GE and Jack Welch's time and see that it was actually not a great time, because the way that he was actually able to increase the profits and therefore increase the shareholder value quarter after quarter after quarter. He was just a miracle worker, just consistently did this. First of all, he cut employees so much down to the bone. You acquire companies, merge them together back into GE, and then just slash the workforce, reducing the cost and increasing profits. On average, he cut about 10% of employees at GE every single year. Did a lot of merging and acquisitions of competitors, reducing the competitiveness, increasing again the profits by not having to compete as much. Did lots of offshoring and buybacks of shares, again, to increase the stock price. And all of this, in the end, did not do GE many favors. And there's a great book I highly recommend called The Man Who Broke Capitalism by David Gillis from the New York Times. This is a fantastic book that looks historically at what happened at GE, what happened on the surface from the outside, and then what actually happened internally. And now we see GE, a much, much diminished version of itself, actually breaking into 3 different companies now. And the financial engineering in the end really did not actually increase the value of GE. In many ways, set it up for its demise and its decline. So one of the things to think about here is, how do we think about now the upside of capitalism? How do we use the value of capitalism, the engine behind it, to actually increase and spread the value amongst all stakeholders, not just shareholders? So I want to take a moment and just say hello to Wilson. Wilson, glad you're joining here today. Glad you like this topic. I'm going to go into that a little deeper. And Najib, again, thank you for joining too as well. Again, this is a bit of a history lesson, but I wanted to go through and just explain just how this is actually happening. So one of the things that the Business Roundtable did was to really define the 5 different types of shareholders that were available. And let me just put up that slide here. And these are the 5 shareholders the stakeholders that the Business Roundtable defined: customers, employees, suppliers, and by that definition, also the partners that you have supporting the business. You have your communities, and they included the planet in that by definition, and then their shareholders. I would actually, you'll see in some of my work later this month, include very specifically the planet, because the interesting thing about the planet is it doesn't truly have any advocates for it. We also have to think about the government and NGOs, the people who actually provide a lot of the services to communities as entities who also need to be supported and see their value increased. And then also regulators, because they're the ones who oftentimes constrain capitalism, but can also enable it to happen. So these are all the different types of shareholders that you could have. But I think one of the things we also want to look at is just historically, why did this cause such astir in 2019. Well, a couple things are happening. And one of the things I really like to take a look at is what was going on behind the scenes during this time period from the 1970s until about 2015 or so. The shareholder mentality was the thing that was really preeminent in the minds of CEOs, the board of directors, and sort of shareholders, that you've got to be constantly increasing the share price. And what was interesting is that there was more and more of a recognition that this was just not sustainable. And in particular, one of the things that was developing in the background at the same time with the UN's United Nations coming out with the whole idea of sustainable development, because there was such inequality between countries with the income disparity between people. Instead of raising up incomes the way that capitalism has been doing for decades, it was now separating, and more of the profits and the value was accumulating to the various highest levels of people, and there was this increasing income disparity between the top and the bottoms. And so, and people were recognizing this is not sustainable. So how do we need to be thinking about this? And the UN came up with these sustainability goals, the 17 sustainability goals. And they have everything to do with reducing poverty, increasing education, especially of women, looking at the climate, looking at our communities, looking at income disparity, but also thinking about how do you support businesses and sustain businesses too as well. So we call these the UN SDG goals. We have the Business Roundtable goals. And I'll just share with you, this is all coming to a head when the Business Roundtable announced its purpose of a corporation, because pressure was building. And a couple of people who were very instrumental in this was the CEO and chairman of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon. He's still there. And he was also the chair of the Business Roundtable when they made this announcement. And he wrote in a statement, major employers are investing in their workers and communities because they know it is the only way to be successful over the long term. These modernized principles reflect the business community's unwavering commitment to continue to push for an economy that serves all Americans. And that was the idea behind the Business Roundtable. And also CEOs like Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff was saying, I strongly believe that capitalism, as we know it, is dead, that we're going to see a new kind of capitalism. And that new kind of capitalism that's going to emerge is not the Milton Friedman capitalism that's just about making money. So this is about doing good while doing well. And this was continued on again with the at Davos of the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum actually came out with a whole statement that said, we believe that the purpose of a corporation, again, is to engage all of its shareholders, its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. In creating such value, a company serves not only its shareholders, but all its stakeholders. Again, they list them all: employees, customers, suppliers, local communities, and society at large. You have to harmonize the divergent interests of all of these stakeholders through a shared commitment to policies and decisions that strengthen the long-term prosperity of a company. So the idea here, again, is very consistent, that instead of driving towards short-term quarterly profits that drive shareholder value, the real idea is that that price in shareholder value reflects a long-term increase in value to not just the shareholders, but to the sustainability and the value of the corporation, expressed through the value it creates for its customers, the value it creates to employees, and through the entire ecosystem of suppliers, the communities, and of course, our planet. Now, all of this really started to really matter, I think, especially in 2020, right after this happened, the pandemic hit. And instead of thinking about corporate responsibility and environmental, societal, and governmental goals, ESG goals, as something that was a nice to have, the pandemic really put at this front and center that we need to be thinking much more strategically about how to make all of this happen and work. And some of the pressures that happened during this time were in particular areas around employees starting to get to start advocating for themselves, especially again with the increasing income disparity, and pressures, especially for healthcare and being treated well and treated right, especially with the pandemic, making this so evident which employees were doing well and doing good, and also those who were not. And this one organization, Just Capital, did a fantastic some research, and they just do tons of research around what does it mean to be a just company. And they just released their rankings of the top just companies in the US, and I'll be sharing some of that next week. But you can go and see this actually. Let me just put up the URL here, and I'll also put it into the chat. I realize that this is a nice way to be able to do this, so you can just see it and be able to get it inside of the chat and link to it. So this report showed that the number one issue for companies, for employees, for American workers was fair wages, being paid in a fair and equal way. So one of the ideas here is that it's not just that, it's also about creating jobs in the US, which helps the communities. It's about having ethical behaviors at the top of an organization. Again, the shareholders and the governance, that's reflected in it. Products, making sure that you're protecting worker health and safety. All of these things are really important, so you can see the full list here. And what's interesting is that there's no one dominant issue other than paying a fair and living wage. And which is, again, I think a reason why you're seeing the rise of the unions coming back in again, because individual workers advocating for that isn't enough. And it's called into account these leaders inside of organizations to say, what are you doing? Are you exploiting us and to just make more money for shareholders? But can you also engage us as employees, engage communities, invest in places so that long-term your organization is going to be very successful? One leader said, I know that, this is again from history, that if I don't invest in my community, make sure there's a strong education system, teachers who are well paid and well educated in schools that operate in a safe environment, if that's not there, who's going to train my future workers? If I want to sustain my organization, I'm going to have to invest in that, invest in my communities and give back and make sure that our communities are strong, make sure that our environments are strong for the long term. So I think there's a general sense that we can't just be constantly pulling profits out and returning back to shareholders. We also need to be thinking about making this a win-win with our stakeholders across the board. Now, this is really hard because there's so much pressure from investors to make sure that you are returning the fair returns. And so what we've been seeing over the past couple of years is that investors are getting involved in this too as well. And most notably, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest hedge funds in the world, came out with a statement back in the beginning of 2022 in an investor letter. And he also, and I'll put this letter into the comments too as well. And this is a fantastic letter. And he basically says, that it's not just about stakeholder capitalism isn't this woke idea. It's not politics or ideological or social. It's driven by mutually beneficial relationships. It is capitalism by definition. These relationships between you, the employees, the customers, again, the same list, suppliers, communities, and your company relies on to prosper, everybody prospering together. This is the power of capitalism, is what he writes. And this is, again, another watershed moment and a number of watershed moments, because it's when we actually think about capitalism in a beneficial way to everybody that it touches, not just shareholders. Yes, you have to return some value to shareholders, but you also need to make sure that if that is going to be sustained over the long term, then you can't exploit it in the short term at the detriment of your other stakeholders. So the thing that I think is so important, and I think Marissa has a really good point here, the pandemic was a pressure cooker showing the importance of looking for more holistic solutions. Absolutely, exactly. And Marissa, I think it became so clear to us, companies who were doing a good job around saying, I know this is going to be expensive, we're going to do the right thing. We saw companies sending people home, shutting down operations before it was required by companies. We saw people giving, again, healthcare and providing these things in the short term, doing their best to be able to help people get to the point where they can be sustained through the pandemic. So I just want to go back and just talk a little bit about why this is so important. Because I think now more than anything else, as leaders, we need to find ways to make this type of prospering, of sustainable life of companies in a way. And I'm not saying it's easy, as you'll see over the next couple of weeks. This is incredibly difficult to do. It's fraught with lots of pitfalls and obstacles along the way. I mean, if there was an easy way to do this, we'd have figured it out. And everybody would feel really good about, we're all practicing stakeholder capitalism. Isn't this great? And the reality is, it is incredibly difficult to do, because to find win-win situations and outcomes for everybody in a system where it's much easier to see the win-lose outcomes and to just follow those. That is the path forward, and it's going to require a lot of innovation, a lot of ingenuity, a lot of out-of-box thinking. Frankly, it's going to require a lot of disruptive thinking. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is because I believe that you, as a disruptive leader, as somebody who looks and says and sees this possibility in looking at and taking what's worked in the past, but also finding new ways to make it work in this new future that we're trying to craft together. So my belief is that you, as a disruptive leader, can take the lead in showing the path forward of how do we do this? How do we find ways forward to make stakeholder capitalism work? So that's what I wanted to do today, was to define it, give a little bit of history. And then next week, I'm going to be talking about what is the actual state of stakeholder capitalism? How well are we doing? What's working? What's not working? And I can tell you a lot isn't working. But there are some real spots of fantastic examples of how this is starting to work. And we'll look across different industries, we'll look at different examples and different approaches. And I just want to do that reality check of how difficult it is, but also point to examples of some paths forward. That's what I'll talk about next week on this. And then the week after, on the 24th, we'll talk about metrics. How do you actually measure this? Because it is a complete mess. There are metrics all over the place, but do they actually measure value? And we'll talk about how to actually measure value versus these vanity metrics that make you feel good, but aren't necessarily going to move the ball forward. And then the last week in January, we'll talk about how to overcome some of the biggest obstacles, in particular, the scarcity myth, that you can't do this without some sort of trade-offs, that trade-offs are inevitable instead of being able to find win-wins. So we'll talk about how to overcome that and how to find a path forward. So that's what I have for today. I hope you enjoy this journey over the next few weeks about and exploring what does it mean to practice stakeholder capitalism. And I do think about it as a practice. It is something I believe that we as leaders, we as companies need to find a way forward. And no matter how difficult it is, no matter how awkward it feels, it is something that we're going to have to look at in order to make sure that our companies, that our communities, that our societies are in the long term sustainable. I look forward to sharing this journey with you. In the meantime, I'm just going to give you one little bit of homework to think about. And that is, how do you think about stakeholder capitalism? Who are your stakeholders? Who are your most important stakeholders? And start thinking about how you create value for them. And would love to have that conversation. Again, feel free to message me anytime. Come ready with some questions and discussions, and I'll see you next week. Take care.